Chapter 15. For the 3 days that the boys spent at Waba, the fine winter weather continued. It was cold, of course. 20 to 30 degrees below zero was the normal temperature for that time of year. But neither dogs nor humans minded such weather. They put in the time profitable, cutting and hauling firewood, visiting their father's traps to the south of the lake, and mending snowshoes and dog harness. Meanwhile, the girls had returned from Nikina, and the evenings the cabin rang with their good times. The night of the 14th, Big Lindsay lit his pipe and stretched his long legs beside the stove. "You boys plan to start back tomorrow?" he asked. "I was," Jim answered. "Why, you want me to do anything for you?" "No, I was just thinking that the three of us might cruise up north of your country and see how the fur sign looks. Used to be an old trapline in there. Don't believe it's been worked for 4 to 5 years. "Fine. Think you ought to undertake a trip like that, though, yet?" Jim asked. "Huh," his father grinned. "Reckon I can keep up with the young shavers round here. You and Lindsay get your duffel ready. We'll get off early." So it came about that the three of them left Waba before daybreak next morning. Jim cut straight across to his line on Porcupine Lake with his dogs, while the other two Lindsays took another team and followed the more roundabout route to the east. Crossing the high ground between the lakes, Jim sighted a good-sized bull moose feeding in the poplar thickets. Otherwise, the trip was made without incident, and he reached Porcupine in time to make the circuit of the lake and tending his traps. In the last one he visited, there was a mink, carrying it proudly across the ice, heading for his cabin, and saw Lindsay and his father coming through the dusk. "Hi there! Look what I got!" he shouted. Lindsay laughed. "Look what we got!" he answered, and held up another mink that might have been the twin brothers of Jim's. "Pretty good day's work," the elder Vanderbeck remarked, "but you'll have plenty to catch in the next couple weeks. Breeding season will be coming soon, and the best of the fur won't take bait from then on." It snowed that night, and the flakes were still drifting down steadily when Jim crawled out of bed to light the morning fire. "Want to lay up here till it's over?" he asked his father. But the big woodsman sniffed at the air and shook his head. "This won't last more than another hour or two. How deep is it out there?" "Plenty deep," Jim replied. "Must be a foot of new snow, real light and fluffy." "Well, we can make it to your main camp anyhow," his father decided. The boys took turns at breaking trail ahead of the sleds, and they reached Squaw River by midday. Sure enough, the snow had stopped falling, and the low sun shone through breaking clouds. Jim and Lindsay built a fire in the stove and left their father in the cabin while they went downriver along the trap line. Many of the cubbies were buried so deep the boys had to dig them out, using their snowshoes as shovels. It was hard work. When they had finished excavating a trap house 3 or 4 miles below camp, Lindsay mopped his damp forehead with his sleeve. "Look at that," he grumbled. "Not even a nibble at the bait. I don't believe there's any fur down this way anyhow." "Guess not. Must be all the animals hiked off up the river to your country. Well, it's getting late. You start back. I've only got to look at one more." 50 paces up a near brook he had made a water set weeks before. The blaze on a spruce above the bank showed him where it was, and he knelt down, pulling the snow away with his mittened hands. The trap was no longer on the log. He found the stake and followed up the chain link by link. Then a sweep of his gauntlet uncovered soft brown fur. He pulled up the trap and chuckled as he took out a fine big mink. The light in the cabin window made a welcome yellow beacon as he plodded up the trail through the dark. Trapping was a lot more fun, he decided, when you had your own folks for company. They struck north next morning under bright, cold stars. Another half-dozen miles of heavy braking through the heart of the bush, they came to a good-sized brook. "This looks like it," said Big Lindsay. "Cast around a little and see if there's any blazes." The boys had not hunted long before Jim's keen eye picked out a weathered gray spot the size of his hand on the side of a tree. He gave the old coo-ee call that he and Lindsay had used in the bush, and soon the two dog teams came straining along in the snow tracks. Constantly, as they plowed along northward, the eyes of the three woodsmen searched the snow. Occasionally, a rabbit track crossed their trail, but that was all. At sunset, Big Lindsay called a halt. "It's been more than 24 hours since the snow stopped," he said. "If there was any fur round about here, we'd see sign before this. It's too far to go back. Better get started on a camp for the night." Sleeping out comfortably in January on the Hudson Bay slope required a certain skill, but the boys knew what to do. The first thing was to find a big tree with some open space under it. A short distance up the brook, they came on to a huge old pine nearly 3 foot across the butt. Jim took an axe and went after poles, while Lindsay and his father scooped away the snow from in front of the tree. They cleared an area as large as a small room, piling the snow in a yard-deep bank around it. Then they scattered the ground thickly with balsam boughs. By this time Jim was back with a dozen long straight poles, which he proceeded to brace against the tree in a semicircle. The sled canvas from the 2 toboggans was now brought and wrapped around the poles to make sort of a lean-to. "That looks snug enough," Big Lindsay gave his approval. "All we need now is a fire." In 10 minutes the boys had a bright blaze going in a hollow between 2 roots and close against the big tree. Almost at once the reflected heat began to warm the shelter. They cooked supper and fed the dogs and bedded them down with dry boughs, and were ready to spread their sleeping bags on the soft springy balsam. A low barrier of snow protected their beds from the fire. "There," grunted the elder Vanderbeck contentedly. "Put on a couple big chunks and she'll burn all night, and we'll sleep as warm as summer." It was a trifle chilly crawling out in the morning, with the fire dead and the temperature 30 below. However, Jim had prepared a pile of dry pine kindling the night before. It was only a moment's work to get the blaze going again. For 2 days they continued to cruise the region, taking different directions in order to cover more ground. They were far beyond the abandoned trapline now. Jim might have been thrilled by the knowledge that he was exploring country where possibly white men had never been before. But that was no new experience for him, for the scarcity of fur sign disappointed him. Also, the constant effort of breaking trail was hard and tiring. It was with a sense of relief that they headed back towards the squaw, with the unset traps still on their sleds. After a night in Jim's home camp, the three bade each other goodbye. Lindsay went westward towards his own country. Their father started the homeward trip to Waba, and Jim, piling supplies on his toboggan, took the trail downriver. It was high time he was getting over his line again. Now, in the dead of the far north winter, one day was much like the other. There was a rhythm to living which gave the boy plenty to occupy his strong body and left his mind free to think and plan. If the weather was clear, he got out of his bough bed around 5:30 in the morning, hustled into his outer clothes and started a fire in the tin camp stove. While the flames were taking hold of the dry wood, he filled 2 pails with snow and set them on the stove to melt. Then he carefully rolled up his eider-down sleeping bag, wrapped it in its tarp, and set about getting breakfast. Usually he made himself a bowl of oatmeal porridge, which he ate with powdered milk, dissolved in water and a little sugar. He carried prunes, dried apples, or dried peaches in his grub box, and a handful of these gave some balance to his diet. He ate bread if he had it, made a cornmeal johnny cake, and fried a strip of bacon. Butter was something he had learned to do without. A pan of cocoa or tea completed the meal. When the tin dishes were washed and repacked in the grub box, it was time to take the trail. The toboggan, leaning up against the shack for the night, was laid in the snow, with the dog harness stretched out in front of it. The sled canvas was spread out flat, and the packing began. Next to the up-curled nose of the toboggan, Jim placed the dog pail, with a sack of cornmeal and 4 or 5 spare traps inside. Back of the pail came the folded 7x10 wall tent, which he usually carried for emergencies. Then the heavy grub box containing food and utensils. A bundle of frozen fish for baiting traps and feeding the dogs was placed next, and behind it the pack sack, filled with clothes and small necessities. Riding the tail of the sled was the folding tin stove with its telescoping pipe. Jim laid the bedroll lengthwise on top, pulling the sides of the canvas up around the load. Starting from the front, he lashed it tight and thrust his rifle under the lacing. The axe was put in front, under the nose of the toboggan. One at a time, he led the dogs from their huts behind the cabin and harnessed them, Bruno first, then Paddy. The chains were thrown into the dog pail, and Jim moved out ahead of the team on the snowshoes. Breaking trail in heavy snow, he was lucky to make 2 miles an hour. Visiting the traps took additional time. As he came to each one, he looked to see if it was sprung, brushing the loose snow away, and made sure the bait was not stolen. Sometimes he'd find half a dozen traps in a row untouched. Then he might come to 3 or 4 together that held the bodies of Canadian jays, squirrels, and rabbits. Still, there was always the chance of discovering a mink or a marten frozen between the steel jaws. Unless he was in a hurry, Jim stopped at noon for a bite of lunch. He stripped the boughs from 2 or 3 small trees for the dogs to lay on, took such supplies as he needed out of the grub box, and turned the toboggan on its side to keep the snow from freezing to the bottom. When his fire was going, he made a pot of tea and thawed out his bread if he had any. With a slice of bacon in the pan, he fried a piece of dried moose meat. It was hard to chew, but it tasted good to a hungry man in the woods. His meal over, he repacked the load on the sled and continued down the river. About 4 in the afternoon, if he had timed his day's journey accurately, he drew near to one of his line camps. While there was still light enough, he dug out the dog houses with a snowshoe, brought the chains from the sled, unharnessed the dogs, and fastened each one to his kennel. The harness was hung up on a peg inside the cabin. Then the sled was unpacked, the duffel carried in, and the toboggan itself on its side against the house. The next chore was to feed the dogs. While the fire in the stove was warming the cabin, Jim built another one outside and hung the dog pail half full of snow over the flames. As soon as the water was hot, he threw in some cornmeal, a couple fish, stirred the mush till the meal was cooked. Then, setting the pail in the snow to cool, he got ready for his own supper. His hands had to be washed in snow with a cake of soap he carried in his possible sack. When they were clean, he dug frozen mashed potatoes out of a can, warmed up some baked beans, and chopped some moose meat with an axe to make hamburg. Bread or bannock with brown sugar was his dessert. Jim's utensils were few, but they served all of his needs. Besides the tin cup and plate, the hunting knife and the iron fork and spoon, he had a frying pan, a straight-sided kettle pot, and a 5-pound lard pail used as a kettle. While his supper cooked, he found time to take the cornmeal and the fish out to the dogs. The food was portioned out, half to each, with a wooden paddle. The hungry team rushed at it savagely. Jim could sympathize with them. He felt more or less wolfish himself at the end of a long day. It was only by conscious effort that he kept from gobbling his food when he was alone in the cabin. When the meal was finished, he had washed the dishes in the frying pan full of snow water. He skinned such fur as he had caught that day. Then he made himself comfortable on the bough bed, read a little or wrote in his diary by candlelight. He had whittled a paddle out of spruce chip and sharpened the small end so that it could be thrust into the chinks between the log. His candle was stuck firmly on the paddle with a drop of hot wax. When he needed the light in any part of the room, he simply shoved the wedge of wood into a convenient cranny. Bedtime was when he felt sleepy, ordinarily around 8:30. He stripped to his heavy woolen underwear, slid into the eiderdown, and pulled the tarp up around it. A minute or two later, he was soundly and dreamlessly asleep. By the 23rd of January, Jim had covered his trap line as far down as the burnt land beyond the lower camp, visiting the cubbies around Beaver Lake, and made his way back to the lean-to at the head of the long carry. All day there was a heavy warmness in the air. For the first time in months, the snow felt wet and soft. It clung soggily to his snowshoes and doubled the labor of breaking trail. He woke in the night to an unfamiliar sound, the drum of rain on a part of roof where the snow had melted. That meant there'd be no traveling tomorrow. He turned over contentedly and went to sleep again. The first day of inactivity passed pleasantly enough. Jim loafed around camp, mending his dog harness, and washed a few clothes. Outside, the temperature stayed well above the freezing mark. Water dripped steadily from the sodden trees. Luckily, the boy had brought along a couple of books in his possible sack. When he performed all the chores he could think of, he sprawled near the open front of the cabin and read. The following morning it had stopped raining, but the air was, if anything, even warmer. He put on his snowshoes and made a try at walking along the trail, but the snow was so heavy with water that it was almost impossible to move. Out in the river he could see a foot-deep mass of soft slush. There was still another restless day in camp before the weather swung back to the north and the weather began to turn colder. When Jim woke in the morning of the 27th, there was icicles hanging in a fringe from the lean-to roof, and the air had a real nip to it. Eagerly the boy dressed, got breakfast, and prepared to take the trail. As soon as the dogs were harnessed, he led the way down to the bank of the river. "Come on now, Bruno, old boy, mush!" he called cheerfully. "Let's see you mush!" The big lead dog was as keen for action as his master, but he had a hard time keeping up. Where the thin crust on top of the slush would bear Jim's long snowshoes, it broke under the dog's weight. Their floundering progress was soon made more difficult by balls of slush frozen to their feet and weighing down the fur under their bellies. When Jim came back to scrape the ice off their toes, he realized it was useless to go on. Nothing for it but to wait another day. For 24 hours the temperature continued to drop. It was so cold that night that Jim built a shelter of boughs across the front of the lean-to and kept up a roaring fire in the stove. At daybreak, he felt the crust solid enough to hold his weight, even without snowshoes. His imprisonment was over at last.